Hello, I'm Sleepy7, and before I go to bed, I want to talk about my Magic the Gathering Commander deck. So this is one of my favorite decks. This is an elemental typal deck where, has all sorts of elemental creatures. Elementals in Magic are some of my favorite creatures because a lot of them are just kind of like abstract, especially like the Lorwyn ones. But even beyond those ones, I just enjoy incarnated forces of nature, and I also enjoy the ones that are like based on concepts more than anything as well. This isn't really an optimized deck or anything. It's more of a deck just kind of for fun, because my main goal was to try to like cram in as many cool elementals as possible, in like so much so that I am trying to cut back on the number of cards in the deck that aren't either lands or elementals. So if it's not elemental type, I'm trying to find replacements for them so I could just have more elementals instead of just like, oh, it's the sorcery enchantment or something like that. Anyway, this is a, has standard 199 cards plus commander. That's the rules, but I also have the companion right here. Jegantha the Wellspring, which is a card originally from Ikoria. This is the March of the Machine multiverse version or whatever. That's like based on like the comic book style art that they did for Ikoria. And, it's cool. Elemental deer, that's neat. They definitely need to change the elk type to just deer because there's a lot of elks in this game that really kind of aren't elks. Elks are basically just like moose. It's kind of a funny type right there. See, that's cool is that this actually combos kind of okay with Horde of Notions. So, which is, Horde of Notions is my commander. So you can either get Jegantha out earlier or Horde of Notions. It kind of doesn't matter. But if you get Jegantha out, you can tap it and just play Horde of Notions. Whoa. Or if you have Horde of Notions out and then get Jegantha out, you could tap it and boom, you can do Horde of Notions ability right away, which lets me play elementals for my graveyard, which is pretty awesome. But yeah, Horde of Notions has like a special purple sleeve that's not actually particularly special. It's just like a different sleeve to differentiate it from like these golden sleeves the rest of the cards are in. It's gold because the deck is 5 color, and that means it's gold. So I bought the new Lorwyn Elementals deck too because, it has elementals in it. I just kind of have to add them, right? So we have Massive Mysteries, which is like kind of a retrained version of Horde of Notions, or maybe this is like the Horde of Notions Sun or something. I don't know. But this is pretty cool because it combos with a lot of elementals that have enter the battlefield effects or leave the battlefield effects. So when you have Massive Mysteries out, you can target your Shriek Maw or something, and then you can just kill 3 other creatures all at once. That's pretty cool. Got Ashling the Limitless, she's cool because she lets me evoke everything, all of them, which is awesome. And evoke it for 4 generic is probably a bad choice for card design wise, honestly. I would have probably done red mana. Not a single red mana, but some amount of red mana, just so I could kind of limit its usefulness. But I don't know, this is kind of funky, and this could, in theory, any of these 3 could technically be my commander because they're all 5 color. So if I wanted to, I could have a rotating commander, and they're all pretty good and add to the strategy I'm kind of going with. And Flame Braider is a funny card that was added in the new Lorwyn. It's funny because it's just a straight up better version of Smoke Braider. So that just means I have 2 mana dorks in here that tap for 2 mana, which is awesome. Splinter Fright is pretty cool because it fills up the graveyard with more elementals for my Horde of Notion to just recur. Storm Entity. Now this one's pretty cool. I don't remember the context of this, but this is special promo. I think it was given out for like in-store play or something like that. And it has this like wavy foil pattern. It has like the Future Sight watermark on it because, you know, it was released with like the Future Sight set, you know, this is a card from Future Sight. You know, it has the cool little Future Sight frame that I wish would come back in some capacity. So this one's fun because there's a point in this deck where I could just like keep casting elementals just for free over and over and over again. And eventually I could just cast a giant storm entity, which is fun. And then I could just kill someone with haste damage. Doesn't technically have trample, but there is a card in here that grants trample. So that shouldn't be necessarily a problem. You know, Maelstrom Wanderer, another pretty cool legendary elemental. He's really only in here because I mean, it's cool. Look at it. It's a legendary elemental. That's cool. It gives all my creatures haste, which is pretty neat, but that's 8 mana, so that's pretty not neat. Here's Omnath, Locus of the Royal. You know, ETBs and deals a ton of damage to creatures. Any target, actually. So it could, like, destroy an opponent if I just have enough elementals. This combos really well with Risen Reef, because Risen Reef is kind of a non-deterministic combo where I could just keep dropping more and more elementals and lands and stuff. Here's a Mole Drifter. This one's cute. This is like a secret lair that was like a charity secret lair for a children's hospital. I forget which one, but they had like the kids draw like magic cards, and then they'd have like the professional artists do like an interpretation of the creature or whatever they drew. This one's a Mole Drifter, which is one of the better elementals ever, because it's not only a pretty decently, I mean, it's not really that good stats like comparatively, but it does draw you 2 cards, and then it also has Evoke, and Evoke essentially makes it double as a spell, and it gets sacrificed, goes to the graveyard when it's evoked, which means it fills up the graveyard. I could run it again with Horde of Notions. Not only that, but if I had a Massive Mysteries out, if I had a Mole Drifter out, and then I go to attack, I could give Mole Drifter Myriad, and then I would instantly just get 3 more Mole Drifters on the field, which would be 6 card draws, which is, you know, that's what we call value. Here's Silverglade Elemental. This one's from, I think it's Mercadian Masks, and this is just a ramp piece. It gets me a forest card. It's 5 mana, so like it's not the best ramp out there, but it's ramp on an elemental. It's also a foil. My favorite frame is the retro frame. Like, if a card has a retro frame variant, I will typically go for that one. There's retro foils especially are pretty awesome. And Shriekmaw, I talked about this one earlier. Shriekmaw kills a creature that's non-artifact, non-black, so it's basically just terror on a stick. And not only is it terror on a stick, but it also has, the evoke. So, like I said, it basically acts just like a sorcery, except on a creature. And, like I said, Massive Mysteries, I can, attack with it. 3 more Shriekmaws. Night Incarnate, this is a mass removal on a stick. It basically just kills everything if it's 3/3 or less, which is pretty good. And the fact that it's a creature, the fact that you can evoke it and send it to the graveyard means that you can recur it over and over again with like Horde of Notions or something. And if it doesn't kill things, you still get a 3/4 Death Toucher. Chakram Retriever. So this one is an interesting card. It's from Battle Bond, which was like a multiplayer kind of gimmick set where you would be on teams and it would be like 2v2. It's which is called Two-Headed Giant in this game. And what's cool about this one is a, like I said, non-deterministic combo. I can just keep casting elemental spells over and over again, and I get to untap a target creature every time I cast a spell. which means like say I have like a Flame Raider out, I could just keep untap, tap, like tap, untap, tap, untap, tap, you know, just keep getting infinite mana, or with Gigantha or something. Here's Lord of Extinction. See, this one is pretty cool because it just looks pretty cool. I mean, look at that. It's also in, I don't remember what they called them, but back in the day, they had these special cards that you can pull in packs that were like really, really, really rare, like art variations of cards. And this one is from Amonkhet, which these ones weren't very popular because like people are like, oh, you can't read the name and it's stupid or whatever, but it's fine to me. Like, you know, it's kind of cheesy up there, but you know, otherwise it's kind of, it's fine. This one is in here just kind of for cool factor, although it does combo well with like the whole like graveyard thing my deck has going on. So, you know, I fill up the graveyard, drop my Lord of Extinction. It has like a ton of power and toughness. It's just a big beater, basically. It's nothing too special. You know, here's Foundation Breaker. You know, it's just it's basically just a naturalize on a stick, which is lets me destroy and target artifact or enchantment. You know, like I said, just keeps comboing with all the ETB stuff, or which ETB means enter the battlefield. It combos with like, you know, filling up the graveyard. It combos with like anything that copies, you know, stuff like that. You know, this is Flamekin Harbinger. You know, this is pretty cool because for 1 mana, I get to search for an elemental card, which, you know, it's very, very flexible because most of my elementals are kind of double as like removal or otherwise double as a spell too, which is, you know, why I'm trying to aim to remove all the cards that aren't elementals or lands, because then I have more options. So this is Ingot Chewer. It just destroys an artifact. It's kind of like a worse version of Foundation Breaker, but it's still not a bad option because he costs only 1 mana to evoke rather than the 2 that Foundation Breaker costs. And, you know, that 1 mana can make a difference. That's like a 100% price increase, man. So, like, it makes a difference. Null Drifter is like a variation of Mole Drifter back here. And it's just good to have, like, 2 of these effects for redundancy. It's just that Null Drifter isn't as good, actually, from this deck because, unlike most other evoke elementals, it's a cast trigger instead of an enter trigger. So that means this only happens when you cast it, which means that, you know, you draw the cards and the cards is generally uncounterable unless they have like a card that can counter abilities, but it doesn't combo with like things that double ETBs. It doesn't combo with like things that make it enter the battlefield instead of casting. It just doesn't combo as easily. But this is it, you know, it's still kind of otherwise good because it's still an elemental and it still draws cards. And speaking of elementals that are good, this is Scalding Viper from I think Wilds of Eldraine. So this one is cool because it literally has a spell stapled to it. It's Steam Clean, which is just like a bounce spell. It returns a card to its owner's hand, you know, like a permanent card that's on the battlefield, like a creature or an enchantment or something. That's removal. It's cheap removal, and not only that, it actually has like, so this is kind of a weird combo. So say you have a Scalding Viper in the graveyard and you play Horde of Notions, you have Horde of Notions out, you like activate Horde of Notions ability. You can actually cast Scalding Viper as Steam Clean instead of Scalding Viper, so you can get an extra spell out of it. This will exile itself, and then you can cast Scalding Viper off of the adventure, which is a pretty interesting thing. Well, here's another adventure elemental. This one's just like kind of a card filtering card. It's So like this is just kind of in here because I wanted more spells that gave me more draw, card options. Its ability kind of doesn't help. It's not really in here for being like for like the creature half. It's more in here for the spell half, because this is still an elemental spell that technically costs 2 mana that gets me some card filtering. And it also fills up the graveyard by letting me discard my hand, which that isn't necessarily the best way to fill up the graveyard, but this, in a sense, kind of reads draw 2 cards just straight up, because I can reuse stuff from the graveyard. So it's not a complete loss by discarding my hand. So it's actually pretty decent. Here's Incandescent Soulstoke. This is just what we in the Magic industry call a Lord, which means it gives like a subset of creatures +1/+1. And this one's pretty cool because it's a sneak attack for elementals, basically. So it lets you just plop down an elemental onto the battlefield for free, or not for free. It costs like 2, like 1 generic, 1 red. But for pretty cheap. So you can like say, I was gonna say Null Drifter, but that would be pointless. So yeah, you could put like say Shriek Maw. You could just slap Shriek Maw down and instantly get its ability. You can attack with it, and then it dies at the end of the turn. So it's kind of like evoking an elemental, but like with a little more flexibility. Here's Bramble Familiar. This one's pretty cool. So this is like a mana dork, which I'm always looking for more mana dorks that are elementals. So a mana dork is just a small creature that taps for mana, and costs 2 mana and gives you lets you repeatedly tap for 1 green, which is not the best cost rate for a mana dork, but it does have this sorcery on it, Fetch Quest, which fills the graveyard and lets you put a creature that milled away back onto the battlefield. And what's good about this is that this is actually reusable by itself. Anyway, you can cast it as a creature early game, and then later on, if you want to cast the sorcery side, you normally can't, but it has an ability that lets you return it to your hand, and then then you can just cast it for its adventure late game. So it's it's not really a win con, but it's a card that's good both early game and late game, which is pretty good. I like that flexibility. Here's Tempest Heart. The creature side is kind of underwhelming. It doesn't really matter. But the spell side is another card filtering thing. So for 2 mana, I get to draw a card, or draw 2 cards, and then I have to discard 2 cards. But as I said, since I use the graveyard in this deck, that discarding cards isn't really that big of a downside. Discard my 2 worst cards for 2 potentially better cards, while also having the potential to recur the bad cards later is pretty good. Say I have a card I can't cast that's super late game card. I could just discard it and cast it later with Horde of Notions in the late game. Here's an interesting card. So this one is a Tangled Florahedron, I believe, but it's a Japanese version. This was only ever released in a magazine over there. I don't remember which magazine, but this is a variation that has a little magazine logo watermark, and it's actually double-sided. So this is a mana dork, right? It costs 2 mana to cast a creature that taps for 1 green. But you can also play it as a land, so that comes in tapped. So if you need the extra ramp, you can just cast this side. If you just need a land drop, you can cast this, or you don't cast lands, you just play this side. And that's some extra flexibility. And since this counts as an elemental, that also means you can cast Flamekin Harbinger and search for this if you like are absolutely desperate for a green land. That's not necessarily the best use of Flamekin Harbinger, but it is a use. Runaway Steamkin. This one is actually recommended to me by one of my friends that I play like Magic in an online group, and he just recommended, why don't you put Runaway Steamkin in your deck? You have a lot of red cards, so it'll work, and it's kind of fun. So you just have this guy who you can just keep casting red spells over and over and over again, and every time you get 3 +1/+1 counters on it, you can remove them and get 3 red mana, and that's pretty good because that's like a pretty big burst of mana for not that much investment, especially because the +1/+1 counters have persist between turns, so you can just remove them when you need them. And that's actually pretty good mana production, like all things considered. Now here's a Realm Walker. This is actually not an elemental, but it still is. So this is a changeling, which means it has every creature type, which means this technically counts as an elemental, so it's in the deck. This lets you choose a creature type, which, in my case, it's elemental, and then I can cast elementals off the top of my deck, and that's just, that's really good. And the fact that it's an elemental means it combos with all my other elemental cards. And here is, I think this is called like Muldrotha. It's like Muldrotha the Gravetide or something. And this is a Japanese, JP Japanese language version of the one from Commander Masters. I bought the Japanese version because it was cheaper. So in Magic, there's no rule preventing you from using other language cards in your deck. Unlike other card games like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon, where you have to use like your language cards in a deck, you can't mix languages either. Magic, all the cards do the same thing. You just look up what the card does on like Gatherer or like Scryfall, because Scryfall is better than Gatherer. And if there is any confusion, this one's good because it lets you cast spells from the graveyard. So you can cast one each of a. If I recall correctly, what it does is you can cast one each of a creature, enchantment, sorcery, instant, just like for every card type, basically. This is mostly creatures, so just once per turn I get to cast a new creature from my graveyard, and you can actually evoke off of Muldrotha, which means you can just like bam, evoke like a Shriek Maw for 2 mana, and then goes right back to the graveyard. This is Revelark. This is like creature recursion right here. So when it dies, when it leaves the battlefield, you can return up to 2 creature cards with power 2 or less to the battlefield. So this like kind of revives your smaller creatures, like say you want, like Scalding Viper on the battlefield, or like Mole Drifter back on the battlefield or something. You can do that with Revelark, and you can evoke it to do it. It's interesting actually that Revelark has a more expensive evoke cost than just casting it normally, because this is a leaves the battlefield. So when you cast it normally, it just sticks there and does nothing. But if you evoke it, it dies and you're going to do it instantly. So that's why it costs more to evoke. And I always liked this art. Like, it's just so abstract. It's like a bush with like eggs of light in it and like bird wings. It's like very non-standard elemental, like what is it an elemental of? Well, I guess it's an elemental representing the concept of revelation. So this is like kind of supposed to evoke in one of those like monstrous angels from the Bible. Here's a Grinning Ignis. This one's fun because if you could reduce the cost of this, it actually gets you infinite mana. And since I have like many ways to reduce costs of elementals, this is like trivially easy to get going. So, that's just another one of those like sort of enablers for this deck. And it's also fun is that Future Sight Frame. Here's Animar. Speaking of ways to reduce my elemental costs, this is Animar, Soul of Elements. This was a fairly popular as a commander, although I'm not sure it really holds up in the modern day. But as part of the 99 in this deck, it does some work. So every time you cast a creature, this gets a +1/+1 counter. For every +1/+1 counter on it, it reduces the costs of other creature spells. So like I said, if this has like two +1/+1 counters on it, I can cast Grinning Ignis for 1 red mana, pay 1 red mana, return this to my hand, and it refunds itself, and I could just keep casting it over and over and over and over and over again, and keep getting near infinite mana off of this, and then also getting Animar like infinitely large. So this is like almost an infinite combo right here. I still do need a way to like convert the colorless mana to red mana, but that's trivially easy. Here's Wave Sifter. This is actually another variation of Mole Drifter. So I just have Mole Drifter and Null Drifter. That's fun. Like, I like it when they do like spins on like the same card. So like, woo, you got like the flying fish, you got a flying like goldfish, and then you got a flying horrifying like eldritch abomination fish. But this one's just more card draw kind of. So it investigates, which means that it gives you 2 artifact tokens that draw cards if you sacrifice and pay 2 mana. But it's cheaper to evoke, although the mana cost is more restrictive. So it's kind of like a side grade-ish to Mole Drifter, although I think Mole Drifter is just mostly better, but it's more card draw. Here's Yarok the Desecrated. So this is an elemental that lets you double that enters the like ETB abilities of permanents. So say you cast Wave Sifter or Mole Drifter or something. Bam, cast Mole Drifter. Doubles the ETB and I get to draw 4 cards. I was talking about this earlier, but like Null Drifter, it's a cast trigger, so I only draw 2 cards off of it, even if I have Yarok out. So that's not really a combo there, which is unfortunate. Thicket Crasher. This gives my other elementals trample, which is good because, say, I have a infinitely large Animar. Well, they can just block my Animar and the creature just tanks all the damage and it dies, and I don't deal any damage to the player with Animar. But with Thicket Crashers on here, if I have an infinitely large Animar Soul of Elements, it doesn't matter how much they block of it. It's just gonna explode everyone, and I win. Here's Rescuer Chewinga. So this one is actually a Dungeons and Dragons monster. It's an elemental for some reason. I'm not really sure what element it represents, but it's an elemental, which means it works in this deck. And this has an ETB effect that lets you return permanent cards, another permanent you control, to your hand, which may seem like a downside at first, because like, why would you return your own permanents to your hand? Like, that's kind of stupid. But as you can tell, ETBs, bam, I can cast Mole Drifter again and draw 2 cards. Not only that, actually, but say like I have Horde of Notions being targeted by a kill spell. Well, I can use Rescuer Chewinga, return it to my hand, and it doesn't. Horde of Notions doesn't die, and I can cast it again. So it protects your commander, or just protects any card really, but your commander specifically, because if your commander dies, you can put it back in the command zone and you have to cast it again, but it costs 2 more mana. Well, for 2 mana, I can just return it to my hand and skip that part. Not only that, it costs 2 more mana for every time it's been cast. So say it costs 6 extra mana to cast a Horde of Notions. Well, if I just return it to my hand, it doesn't. I can cast it from my hand for the normal price. this is Morophon the Boundless, I believe it's called. So this is also not an elemental. This is actually a changeling, which means it, as I explained earlier, it has all the creature types, which then makes it an elemental because it just has all the creature types. But this one's fun because if this is out, I can cast Horde of Notions for free. I can cast Animar for free. I can cast Yarok for only 2 mana. And what's cool about Morophon is that it actually combos with Animar, and I didn't realize this until I pulled it off in a game. I was like, oh wait, this works. So I had Animar out, and it was like, I had I don't know, 20 counters on Animar, and then I was like, wait, I can cast Morophon for free. And then I was like, oh wait, Morophon reduces the colored mana cost in spells. I can cast Elementals for free, bam, 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 just infinitely over and over and over again. And then that's kind of what I built my deck around vaguely. And so this one's also technically 5 color, so this could be my commander too if I wanted to, but it's not. Here's a Sulfur Elemental. So Sulfur Elemental is an interesting spell. This one's from the Time Spiral block. I believe it was from, I don't remember which specific set. I want to say Future Sight, but it could be Planar Chaos. But anyway, this is another kind of mass removal spell-esque kind of thing. Not really. So it has Flash, which means you can cast it anytime. And it also has Split Second, which means opponents can't respond to it, so they can't counter it, for example, unless they have there's some weird rules things with some certain cards that you can counter a Split Second card, but that's such an edge case that it kind of doesn't matter, but sometimes it does, and that's funny. But it gives all white creatures +1/-1, which means that any white creature that has 1 or less toughness will just instantly die. And at first I was like, well, why would I ever run that? Because it'll just hurt my own white creatures. And then I realized all my white creatures have pretty high toughness and they won't die. So it would just be largely a buff because more power is better than more toughness usually. Not only that, it would really hurt, say, a white weenie deck or a token deck, because those usually run white. White token decks tend to be a bunch of 1/1s. So plop this thing out, it just kills all their tokens. So here's Voice of Resurgence. It lets me protect myself from opponents casting spells on my turn, kind of. It doesn't prevent them from casting spells on my turn, but it does give me a really big elemental token if I have other elementals out too. So I can have a bunch of weak elementals out, and then they cast a counter spell. Well, then I make a big ass elemental token. And this almost won me a game once. It's just I was playing too defensively and should have got more aggressive. And if I were more aggressive, I would have won, but I was just kind of bad at assessing the situation, so I lost because of a skill issue. Here's Unsettled Mariner. Here's another changeling, and this one's kind of fun, in a meta sense, because this basically gives all your permanents and yourself ward, except ward as a mechanic didn't exist yet, so it's kind of just spells out the whole whenever you or a permanent you control becomes a target of a spell or ability and opponent controls counter that spell unless the owner of that spell or ability pays 1 mana. So this is kind of what they did before ward existed. Nowadays it would probably just say permanents you control and you have ward or something. But it's a weak version of hexproof, where hexproof, it just makes your cards untargetable by opponents. And I figured that would be a pretty decent card to have to protect my creatures, give them a little more resilience. Here's Leafkin Druid. This is just another mana dork. Sometimes it taps for 2 mana instead of 1. I just needed more mana dorks. I talked about this earlier. You have Flame Braider here. Well, here's the original Smoke Braider. They're literally the same cards, but Flame Braider is just strictly better because It's a 2/2 instead of a 1/1. Yeah. Creeping Trailblazer. This one's also like another kind of lord, but it also kind of has late game utility by getting really big if I have a bunch of elementals, although I don't typically use the second ability on this. And honestly, like sometimes this card gets cut and replaced with something else, but if I recall, this one was put in because I cut like a sorcery or something. I don't remember specifically. Here's Spite Bellows. This is another removal spell. For 3 mana, I can just deal 6 damage to target creature. And 6 damage is that's a lot of damage. That kills most creatures that can die to damage. So that's not bad. And it lets you, since it's a creature, I can recur it and stuff. Recurable removal is always good. More recurable removal. This one puts the permanent on top of your opponent's deck. This one's also interesting because evoke cost is the same as the spell cost for some reason. It was probably like something for limited play back then, but this can target any non-land permanent, so that gives you a lot of flexibility with it, even though it's not permanent removal. Putting a card on top of their deck is actually pretty bad for your opponent because it replaces whatever they were going to draw with like something that might not even be that good, like for what they need at the moment. So I like it because it blanks a draw too, as well as removes something. This is Chandra's Ember Cat. It's just another mana dork. It's a cat. Cats are cool. I like cats. Elemental spell or a Chandra Planeswalker spell. I don't have any Chandras in here because Chandra is not an elemental. So it's only for elementals in this deck. Wispmare. It's just it just destroys enchantments. This one isn't as good as Foundation Breaker or even Ingot Chewer, just because enchantments tend to be like not as prevalent as artifacts. But I still wanted more enchantment removal, and for 1 white mana, that's pretty cheap. Here's one of the centerpieces of the deck, Risen Reef. This one's Risen Reef is one of my favorite elementals because I just think it really looks cool. I always liked reef monsters, and this is an elemental based on a reef. That's just like really cool. There's a lot of like non-deterministic combos you can pull off with this thing. Like it just combos with so many elementals, and this thing could like go through your deck, which is why I'm trying to get my whole deck to be either elementals or lands, because that makes the combo more likely to go off. Because if you draw, it technically doesn't draw, but just for the sake of simplification, if you draw an elemental off of this, you can just cast the elemental to have this go off again. If you draw a land off of this, you put the land on the battlefield tapped. So that means you always hit something good if every card is an elemental or a land. Bright Hearth Banneret. This reduces the cost of elementals, which is good. I've already explained why that's good. Farseek. Yeah, this is a ramp card. It pulls out a plains, island, swamp, or mountain. What's cool about this is that if a card is like if a land is like both a swamp and a mountain, you can pull that out. I haven't removed this one yet because this is just like a really good ramp spell. For 2 mana, you can pull out basically any color you need, and it's just kind of hard to remove because like not a lot of cards have that functionality for this price, so I just haven't removed it yet. Here's Gamble, which is also pretty good. So this one's not a creature, this one's another sorcery, and I can search my deck for any card and then I put it in my hand, which is really good for 1 mana. Not only that, I have to discard a card, like just a random card from my hand, which is good in this deck because it's a graveyard deck. So if I discard a card, it's not that big of a loss. I could just recur it later or something. The downside on this thing isn't as big a downside as it would be in other decks. Fell Warstone. Here's another just ramp piece I have that, for 2 mana, it's just like a good, that's a good price for a mana rock. So, that's why I haven't removed it yet. This produces a mana that a land an opponent controls could produce, which kind of doesn't matter because this is a 5-color deck, so it's always going to produce something I can use. Nature's Lore. kind of similar to Farseek, except it only searches for forests instead of all the other types of basic lands. But this is similar in the sense that you can like pull up like a forest swamp or like a forest mountain or something like that, and it just plops it right straight on the battlefield. Chromatic Lantern. This is another mana rock that another non-elemental I just haven't removed yet, because it turns all my lands into 5-colored lands, which is good in a 5-color deck. I don't know why this is off to the side. It's not the best mana rock because it costs 3 mana, but the ability on it is just, it works in this deck. Panharmonicon. So Panharmonicon is pretty similar to Yoroke. They basically do the same thing, except this is all permanents. This is only artifacts or creatures, but I haven't removed it because it's basically a second copy of the Yoroke effect. It's also cheaper than Yoroke to cast, so. Wild Growth. This is a 1 mana ramp spell. That's just really good. Since I don't have access to like Birds of Paradise or like Llanowar Elves, Wild Growth is just one of the better 1 mana ramp cards I could use. Nameless Inversion. So this is a textless promo, and that's fun because you can't read it. So that's something I like about Magic, is that since all cards that are named something do the same thing, you can have cards that are just textless and it just works. And so Nameless Inversion is actually a spell card. It's an instant, but it's a kindred instant, which means that it can have a creature type. This creature type is Shapeshifter, but it has Changeling, so it's all creature types. And this gives if I recall correctly, it gives a creature +3/-3 and removes all of their creature types. Removing all the creature types doesn't matter, but this is removal that can be recurred with Horde of Notions, because I can play elemental card, not elemental creature. And so since this is a spell that's an elemental type, I can just cast it. So I haven't removed this one, and I probably won't remove it because this technically is an elemental. Here's 3 visits. It's exactly the same as Nature's Lore. Not much to it. Here's Arcane Signet. It's kind of like a Felwar Stone situation where it's just really good ramp for very cheap. It's 5-color too, so it's kind of hard to remove. Reflections of Littjara is an enchantment that lets me choose a creature type, and I get to copy those creatures that I cast, which means, like, say I cast, I don't know, like Risen Reef or something. I have 2 Risen Reefs now, and like that just increases the amount of wackiness I can do with it. This is also kind of another hard card to remove because this is just such a unique ability that I'm pretty hard pressed to imagine they'd ever print an elemental with this ability. Worldly Tutor. This is kind of like a second copy of Flamekin Harbinger. I get to search for a creature card and put it on the top of my deck. Since all my creatures are elementals, I can always find an elemental. It's another card that's kind of just hard to remove because it's one of those classic 1 mana tutors. Like, those are just really good. Soul Ring. This one's like the icon of the Commander format. It's Soul Ring. It's 1 mana, taps for 2 mana. It's absurdly broken. It's probably one of the best cards in the game. A lot of people argue that the power 9 should have been the power 10, with Soul Ring being the 10th piece of power. But the only reason why it isn't is because it was printed as an uncommon and not a rare, while all the other power 9s were rares. So, this card was just broken but uncommon. These are just lands. Card pollution for, just a bunch of lands. This one's a 5-color land that lets me cast elementals. That's pretty cool. 5-color lands are good in a 5-color deck. So another 5-color land for creatures. This one, wherever I put Farseek, I can cast Farseek, and then I can slap down steam vents, and that gets me blue and red. Or watery grave, blue and black. Like, that's just good. Waterlogged Grove, this one's a good land because early game it's just a land. Yeah, it hurts you every time you use it, but 1 life is nothing in Commander. But late game you can sacrifice it to draw a card, which is, you're going to have a lot of lands out, so losing 1 land for a card is a good trade. I'll put these to the side so we can talk about them all at once. Mountain Valley, that's just a fetch land. Let's search for a mountain or forest. So like I said, I could pull out a steam vents off of this. It does come in tapped, so it's not as good as like the other expensive fetch lands, but this is fairly cheap. Undiscovered Paradise it's a 5-color land, but when you tap it, you have to return it to your hand on your next untap phase, which is actually kind of decent in this deck because there are some cards in here that do trigger off of lands and stuff. So having a recurable land is not bad. This is one of the good fetch lands. You tap it, pay 1 life, and search for a mountain or forest. So you could pull out steam vents. Whoa. And this is like kind of almost like a 5-color land in a trench coat. Yavimaya Cradle of Growth. This turns all my lands into forests. That's cool. Exotic Orchard, just another pseudo 5-color land that enters untapped, which untapped 5-color lands are really good. Murmuring Bosque is a 3-color land. It is a forest, so forests just inherently tap for green, but you can tap it for white or black too, but it'll deal 1 damage to you. So you can like pull this off of like mountain, what was it? You can pull this off of Wooded Foothills and get a 3-color land out. It usually enters tapped because, this is a card made for Tree Folk decks. When it enters the battlefield, you can reveal a Tree Folk from your hand, and if you do, it enters untapped, but otherwise it enters tapped. So usually this is entering tapped. But let me pull out, like, say, Nameless Inversion, for example. So Nameless Inversion, by virtue of being a changeling, is also a Tree Folk. So if I had, like, Nameless Inversion in my hand, I could reveal it, and Murmuring Bosque enters untapped. That's like a tiny little combo doesn't usually pop, come off, but it's still pretty cool. This is, I don't remember what this card is called. I want to call it like Great Beyond or something, but I don't actually remember because this is in Russian. But this is like another 5-color land, but it's for elementals only. This one's like Murmuring Bosque, where it only enters untapped if you reveal an elemental from your hand. This is an elemental deck, so it almost always comes in untapped. Here's another fetch land, good fetch land. Grove of the Burned Willows is interesting. So you tap it for red or green, and it makes all your opponents gain 1 life. That's a very small price to pay. Here's a Zagoth Triome. This is a 3-color land with 3 land types. It always enters tapped, so there's no way to make it enter untapped without like another card doing that. But you can cycle it late game to draw a card. No, Ketria Triome, same thing. Here's a I like this. It's like a full art temple garden. This one's from like Unfinity, so this represents like the landscape of a planet or something. Yeah, this is a full art unhinged or unglued card, which brings me to talk about these ones too. So these ones are also full art lands from an unset. So this one's from Unglued, like the first unset. Technically it's not, this is from the list, but this is a reprint of the one from Unglued, and that started a tradition of all unsets having like full art lands. And these ones are from Unstable, and these unstable lands are probably like the most famous full art unlands. because like just look at that. Look at that island. That's like probably the best island ever printed. You know, probably one of the best swamps ever printed. You know, mountain, not as good, but still probably one of the better mountains. You know, they're all made by John Avon. John Avon does like the best lands. Here's another five color land. You know, there's a Plains Island, Flamekin Village. This one's interesting. So this does like the same thing as like Great Beyond or whatever it was called, where you reveal an elemental, this enters untapped. But this is a land that gives a target creature haste if you tap one red and, you know, target your creature, which means like, say when you cast Gigantha, it enters the battlefield, you can't tap it right away because it has summoning sickness. But if you give it haste, then it will overcome its summoning sickness and can be tapped right away first turn it's down. This one is another fetch land, but it's in Chinese. Chinese cards are cheaper because nobody wants them. This is another untapped 5 color land. This is another Chinese dual land. They call these shock lands. They deal 2 damage to you, which is what spell shock does. Here is I think they call these crowd lands, but they enter untapped if you have 2 or more opponents. Commander is a 4-player format, so it always enters untapped. The World Tree is like the land version of Chromatic Lantern. If you have 6 or more lands, all your lands are 5 color. The activated ability on it doesn't matter. Like I could search and I could like get any number of god cards and put them on the battlefield, which like Realm Walker, it's a shapeshifter, it's a changeling. That means it's a god. So technically I can pull it out with the World Tree's ability. It just costs 10 mana, so I would never really do that. Cinderglade enters tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. This one's a land that's probably going to get cut someday just because I don't run that many basic lands. I only run like 1 copy of each basic land. So this more often than not will probably come in tapped, but it's in here because it's a mountain forest, which means it's fetchable off of like you know, your wooded foothills or whatever. Marsh flats. This is another fetch land. This one's from Zendikar Rising. They did like an expeditions art variants. You know, it's pretty cool. I like them. Stomping Ground, that's another shock land. Command Tower, this one's another just commander staple. It's like just a by default, just untapped, all the colors you need. Probably shouldn't have printed it. They did. Oh well. Path of Ancestry, this is another 5 color land, just like Command Tower, except it enters tapped. It also has a little extra effect on it where if you cast a creature spell that shares a creature type with my commander, I get to scry 1, which means I always get to scry 1 whenever I cast a creature spell. Reliquary Tower, it's just a land that gives you no maximum hand size. It's whatever. I don't know why this is off the side. Yabi Mayako is just another dual land. This is the island forest shockland. That's kind of it. You know, this is a cool deck. It has a lot of different, I guess, win cons, although the win cons are kind of not very, I don't know, how would you say, like, consistent, I guess. Like, this is more just an excuse to, like, show off, like, oh, really cool elementals. Like, look at that. Like, that guy's just really cool. Like, look at him. You know, it's like a amalgamation of like bear, whale, deer, thing, and just like a bunch of other woodland creatures and stuff. Like that's just a cool concept for an elemental, right? Like, you know, flame raider, smoke raiders, whatever, but like, you know, Shriek Maw, like look at how cool that is. You know, Omnath, pretty cool. Maelstrom Wanderer, cool. It's like Storm-Entity. You can't even, like, what is Storm-Entity? You know, Splinter Fright. What is even a Splinter Fright? You know, Risen Reef. It's just like all these like super cool elementals is just kind of like the point of the deck. So, well, yeah. That's my deck. I'm going to bed.